Hello and welcome to the third and final presentation for Winesburg, Ohio. As I said last week, are sort of making our way through this story a little bit, or this novel a little bit more slowly than we will later novels. Certainly, I don't believe we spend 3 weeks on anything again until maybe the very last novel of the class. But Winesburg, Ohio is such a central text for the rural American experience in literature. I would say if you went to most literature professors and said, name the American rural novel, chances are Winesburg, Ohio is the one that they say. So it's useful to go through this book slowly to sort of establish our baseline so that when we make references to the rural and how it's portrayed in literature and other books, we can refer back to Winesburg as sort of a comparison, as sort of a yardstick. Um, Not a lot of slides again this week. As you noticed, the sort of reading schedule spaced things out a bit, but I want to take some time to look at the remaining stories. So we start with another one of those sort of shorter, less sprawling stories. We have An Awakening, which is one of the rare stories about George Willard. There are really only, what, three or four in the entire book. And this one, the events are not as interesting to me as a moment that happens in this story. I guess I shouldn't say the events aren't interesting. They're important and you should consider them and feel free to write about them. I just want to focus on this moment, though, when we learn that he, meaning George, felt that all of the people in the little street must be brothers and sisters to him, and he wished he had the courage to call them out of their houses and to shake their hands. This is on page 150. So much of Winesburg is contained in this passage. Certainly, some motivation for George as a character, as the chorus or recorder or reporter or priest, whatever you want to call him, not priest, but confessor, we see here. His desire to share this brotherhood and sisterhood with the town. And we understand why, if we accept the interpretation that Winesburg is really the story of George writing about this town he grew up in, this sentiment here helps us understand that. But it is also, I think, indicative of, if not the actual rural, then certainly one concept we have of the rural in America and in American literature. The idea of people in a rural place as sharing a sort of sisterhood and brotherhood, that they want to be open and direct and fair with each other. In a way that seems possible compared to other locations. It's not that somebody couldn't walk down a street in New York City and say, oh, I want to call out to all my brothers and sisters. The reality is just there would be too many of them there. In a small town, it's conceivable that someone could reach out to everyone in the town and shake their hands and talk about how much they mean to them. And then finally, notice the way this is phrased. He wished he had the courage to call them out of their houses and to shake their hands. The implication there is, of course, he doesn't do this, not because it's impossible, but because he doesn't have the courage. He lacks the motivation or the fortitude to actually do this, whether it would be embarrassing or whether he is just too afraid to do it. And this is, once again, that inability to truly communicate with each other on a basic human level that Winesburg is so interested in. Time and time again, we've seen characters that just, they feel things, and when they try to express them or say them or communicate them, it falls short somehow. It rings hollow. And this maybe is yet another example of that. And this really does become one of the central themes of the entire book. And I would argue you'll see it again and again as we move forward. You also, by the way, saw it in Ethan Frome. So we've talked about rural isolation as a really important theme to come back to. And I suppose you could call this rural disconnection, rural miscommunication. The desire to communicate and share juxtaposed against the inability to quite do that. Which, again, might explain why George Willard writes this book all these years later within the fictional world of the novel. The next story I want to look at is the story titled Queer. Obviously, novel came out in 1917, so the connotations associated with this particular word in the title have changed fairly drastically in the last, almost 100 years. So I believe it's basically being used here in its sort of straightforward definition of strange, unusual. Elmer Cowley feels queer in this book. He feels like he doesn't fit in. He feels unusual or different. And what this story sets up, after sort of having this passage or this story just before dealing with George Willard and how, he doesn't quite feel that he is close enough to the town to knock on people's door and shake their hands. We then shift points of view and see Elmer viewing him as exactly what George Willard just didn't see himself as. So we get this passage. George Willard, he, meaning Elmer, felt, belonged to the town, typified the town, represented in his person the spirit of the town. I'm going to stop there for a second. To what extent do you think this is true right now? We saw George sort of believe he didn't know the town well enough to just be open with them and talk to them all. But then up to this point in the book, we've seen him doing more or less that, maybe more listening than talking. So to what extent is Elmer right here? To what extent is George Willard really a representative of the spirit of this town? Certainly, we see that he wants to understand the town, that he probably ends up writing about the town. So is he the spirit of the town? Is he sort of the ultimate insider in the town, whereas Elmer is an outsider? Something to think about and decide whether Elmer is sort of right in his assessment of George. So we continue to quote, Elmer Cowley could not have believed that George Willard had also his days of unhappiness, that vague hungers and secret unnameable desires visited also his mind. Stop again. If this really is George Willard writing this, or at least the book sets up the idea that George Willard is writing this, then this is actually author George, maybe even the old man from the Book of the Grotesque, letting us in on the fact that he felt this way regardless of what people thought. So, did he not represent public opinion? And had not the public opinion of Winesburg condemned the Cowleys to queerness? Did he not walk whistling and laughing through Main Street? Might not one, by striking his person, striking George, also strike the greater enemy, the thing that smiled and went its own way, the judgment of Winesburg? So there's a lot to unpack here. What is Elmer resisting? Well, he's resisting the fact that he feels like the town judges him and his father's store, that they think they're weird, odd, queer. I don't believe, in reading over the story again, I don't feel like we ever actually get evidence of that, at least not in any sort of hostile or condemning way. I do get the impression that the Cowley store has some slightly less usual items for sale because his father tends to buy those when the salesmen come through. But how that leads to what Elmer believes the view of the Cowley store and the Cowleys are from the town, I don't quite see it. I tend to think that Elmer Cowley has created this outsider persona for himself, or fallen victim to it maybe. And this is something we see in rural places. When we find that person who just can't wait to get out of the small town, which we've talked about again and again, this is certainly one cause of that. This town just doesn't get me, or they're actively against me. I suppose there's a question as to what extent an entire town can be actively against anyone. I suppose it happens, but it doesn't seem that Elmer has done anything to warrant that. So that's going on here. And by personifying the town through George Willard, what Elmer is really resisting is the judgment of Winesburg. And we have talked about this too, how in a small town, because everyone knows everyone, there is this more present sense of judgment. When people step out of their house in the morning, they can assume that people who know them are watching what they do. Again, is this a problem? Is this something that is wrong with small towns, or is this just simply the way human beings behave when they can see and keep track of these things? I live south of Terre Haute. I live not in a small town. I live sort of, I guess, on the outskirts, what I guess you could call the suburbs, if Terre Haute actually had suburbs. But there aren't a lot of people on the street I live on, so when somebody comes out, I see what they're doing. I don't think I'm actively trying to judge them. I don't think that I'm concerned. I'm not trying to decide things about them. I'm just sort of like, hey, what's that guy doing out in his driveway? I'm sure they do the same to me. I don't feel that they think I'm strange because the fact they're looking at what I'm doing. Um, so to some extent, I think this story is about this type of character overreacting, but it also does draw attention to the fact that there are moments where legitimately things sort of can turn south. Think again of Wing Biddlebaum. He was more or less driven out of town by the town before he came to Winesburg. So in that case, the judgment of the town did become sort of an active negative force in his life. So just to summarize some of the points we're making here about this story. First of all, George is viewed as a representative of Winesburg, possibly because he writes for the paper. Because Elmer, especially in 1917 in a small town, like pretty much everybody else who would have been literate, would get a sense of the town through the paper. It's not like they could turn on the TV or the radio and get media from a variety of sources. The Winesburg paper is how people learned about Winesburg, that and sort of direct gossip, I suppose. So George is in a position to sort of by default be the voice of Winesburg, which is exactly what Elmer accuses him of. It's just how actively is George cultivating that as opposed to he's just doing his job as a reporter. The other thing here, and we've touched on this a bit, is the danger of appearance versus reality in rural life. To what extent does reality even matter in a rural place? I mean, I suppose you could broaden that question and say, to what extent does it ever matter versus appearance? We tend to react to appearance. So we know from other stories, including the one previous to this one, that George isn't always happy. But the only thing that matters to Elmer is that he always appears to be happy. Elmer's sense of George, and by extension the town, is by what he can observe, not by the sort of true interior lives of these people, which again brings us back to one of Anderson's focuses in writing this book, that we can't really know those interior lives. And even when people want to communicate them, they really can't. So the entire understanding that Elmer has is based on appearance, not necessarily reality. And finally, just Elmer doesn't feel that he and his father fit into Winesburg culture. And of course, the sort of latent theme here is that Elmer sort of resents his father for not being what he wants him to be, which is, I guess, sort of a basic story as old as human stories go. I mean, you can go back to the Greeks and the Romans and find the resentment of the father and the sort of Oedipus story in ancient theater. Is Elmer overconcerned, or is this actually important in small towns? Well, Wing Biddlebaum tells us that it is important what people think of you. But in this story, I think Anderson leaves the door wide open to feel that maybe Elmer is the one that is sort of knee-jerk reacting here, not necessarily the town. Although I would love to hear an argument to the contrary, maybe in the threads. I am not saying this is the only interpretation. So if you see more evidence that, hey, maybe Elmer actually is onto something, I'd love to hear about it. And finally, just a couple of last-minute observations here before we move on. In the story Queer, one of the central ideas is how much harder it is to be different in a small town. So we've talked a lot about how Elmer is different, or at least perceives himself as different, but it's important to remember that were Elmer to live somewhere besides Winesburg, if Elmer were to live in Cleveland or Akron or Chicago, his difference would not make him feel as unusual. Not that you can't feel sort of unpleasantly different in a larger city, but everything is magnified here, and that is an effect of the small town. Finally, is there importance, sort of thematic importance, in the story ending with Elmer hurtling out of town on the train? First of all, he clocks George, which is very satisfying for Elmer, although we sort of realize George probably didn't deserve it. But Elmer is hurtling out of town on the train. And of course, the symbolism here is one we have seen before. The outsider bristling to escape the small town, jumping onto the train, which really, in 1917, would have been the only way to really leave a town. You weren't going to hop in your Ford because most people didn't have them yet. You certainly weren't going to get in an airplane because no one could do that. You were going to get on the train. The train was the escape from the small town. So the fact that it ends with Elmer moving quickly away from town on the train is not unimportant and will become even more important when we get to the final story. And then we come to the untold lie, which is one of the sort of perfect, small, self-contained stories of the novel. It's not huge and consequential. George Willard does not play a major or really much of a minor role in it. It's really just about a couple of guys working in the fall, and one of them believes that he has gotten his girlfriend or an acquaintance pregnant and thinks he may have to marry her. And so he asks the other man, who is married, for advice about marriage. Whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. What does he think of marriage? And this man, most of his thoughts at the moment regarding marriage are negative, but as the story goes on, he does have some positive recollections. So I'm going to actually jump to the bottom of the slide first. When he finally gets ready to tell him what he has decided about marriage, even though we're not privy to it, the other man says, "Oh, never mind, I figured it out," basically. And then we get this. Ray says, "Well, it's just as well. Whatever I told him would have been a lie," he said softly, and then his form also disappeared into the darkness of the fields. So if he had said marriage is great, you should do it, it would have been a lie. If he had said, "Oh, don't get married, it's the worst thing ever, I'm miserable," it would have been a lie. So this is sort of, we talked early on about how Winesburg, Ohio really takes the short story away from the O. Henry sort of surprise ending that short stories had been known for up to that point. Sort of the Poe approach of the guy getting bricked up in the wall or whatever. And the stories aren't as interested in sort of the gotcha surprise ending. But here, in a way, although it's more of an emotional impact than a shock, a plot shock, we do get the twist ending, or the sort of clever ending, that we spend the whole story waiting to see what the answer is, and then we find out that there is no answer. So how do you interpret this ending? Whatever I told him would have been a lie. What does that mean in light of the story itself? And that, I think, is the central consideration here. So I think, we all probably have an opinion on how that can be interpreted. I certainly have one, but I think I'll leave it open for you to consider. The other thing I want to point out, we haven't talked as much about setting as we could, even though setting is hugely important to Winesburg. Here we're in the fall, and the story keeps talking about Ray's unhappy domestic life, and then it juxtaposes it or sets it right next to the beautiful fall colors of the countryside near Winesburg. What's the purpose of this juxtaposition? How does that setting inform what Ray is saying? And how does it sort of help you understand how we're supposed to be reading it, right? So what is fall? Fall is when sort of everything dies, but it dies sort of in this beautiful way so that it can return after the winter in the spring. So when Ray keeps talking about how sort of unhappy his domestic life is, could the implication be that it's going through sort of its own autumn, but that there will be, certainly by the end of the story, he seems to have reconsidered, and I don't know that a rebirth, that might be stretching it in the season comparison, but that, this would be a different story if they were having this conversation in the dead of winter when everything was dead, or in the spring when everything was coming to life. So don't ever overlook the value of setting as it affects the story and the characters. Next, we get to the story Drink, which is sort of the story of Tom Foster. And on its surface, the story is sort of one of those simple rural stories through and through. A boy who has never been drunk wants to see what it's like to get drunk. I suppose this is not particularly rural, but certainly the sort of slower nature and probably relative lack of things to do for entertainment leads to understanding this motivation a bit more. But before we get to Tom Foster's actual experience with Drink, we get this as Tom comes with his grandmother back to Winesburg. And it says, when they got into the train and it had run out of the city, she, Tom's grandmother, was as delighted as a girl and talked as the boy had never heard her talk before. Knowing that she was originally from the rural area near Winesburg, how should we read this? Is this Does this sort of challenge the sense of the character that can't wait to get out of the small town and never look back? Because it sounds like she did that, and now she is even more excited to be returning. So does this paint the small rural setting or the small town in a more flattering light? That as she has gotten older and gained wisdom, she realizes that maybe the town is better and has more to offer her and her soul than she thought when she was younger. And also, Tom Foster seems to be happy living the simple life after they return to Winesburg. Um, and this itself is a kind of rural stereotype. I mean, when we say the simple life, the association with that is sort of rural existence. You know, rising with the sun, going to sleep with the sun setting, getting up, working, being content, being sort of pleasantly tired at the end of a day of work. Um, the simple life, not worrying about all of the busy sort of concerns that come with life elsewhere. Um, I don't think that the novel rejects that idea, though it certainly complicates it in many instances. Um, the simple life leading to happiness, on one level we see it. Tom Foster seems like a fairly happy guy. His grandmother seems happy to be back. But if you think over the characters that we've seen, uh, they live a simple life in some of the stereotypically rural ways, but their lives are not simple. They are still racked with guilt and fear and anger and concern. Um, so, on a surface level, I think Anderson embraces the simple life. On the interior level, the emotional level of individual characters, I think he argues not so fast. So, as we get to the passage where Tom Foster samples his drink and gets drunk, we get this. In the first place, the night was one to make a sensitive nature drunk. The trees along the residence streets of the town were all newly clothed in soft green leaves. In the gardens behind the houses, men were puttering about in vegetable gardens, and in the air there was a hush, a waiting kind of silence, very stirring to the blood. So, for all of the arguments that can be made about Winesburg critiquing and deconstructing and challenging the idea of the simple life, it is also a novel that is not afraid to embrace it and draw attention to its beauty in, I think, a fairly unsentimental way. This passage is lovely, but the setting, we learn here, is the kind of night that was one to make a sensitive nature drunk. The implication here is almost as if the night calls for Tom Foster to become drunk, that he could almost get drunk on the night itself if alcohol weren't involved. So once again, the rural setting seems to influence actions and characters. If it were pouring rain and were unpleasant or snowing, Tom Foster probably wouldn't want to go out and take the time to try to see what it was like to be drunk. He would probably just stay home and keep warm. So setting influences plot, setting influences action, setting influences character. As Eudora Welty famously said, nothing happens nowhere. Setting is very easy to push behind and say, oh, more small town loveliness. But I encourage you to always look at how it is interacting with plot and character and theme and how setting is used, not just as backdrop, but as active participant. And finally, in talking to George Willard, who gets everything Tom Foster says wrong and gets offended, and it's sort of one of George's less flattering moments in the novel, and a moment that reminds us that he is still a teenager. He's still sort of dominated by his own view of the world and his own sort of selfish desires. But in explaining things to George Willard, we get this. Tom Foster's voice arose, and for once in his life he became almost excited. It was like making love, that's what I mean, he explained. Don't you see how it is? It hurt me to do what I did, and made everything strange. That's why I did it. I'm glad, too. It taught me something. That's it. That's what I wanted. Don't you understand? I wanted to learn things, you see? That's why I did it. So, Tom Foster believes he has learned something, and wanted to learn something, by getting drunk. And he seems to think he succeeded. That might seem counterintuitive to a lot of us. Certainly, I think a common reaction to getting drunk or too drunk is that you learned not to do that again. But Tom Foster seems to have learned something almost spiritual, almost metaphysical here. And my question for you, and I'm not going to answer it, is what did he learn? Is Tom Foster just nuts, or did he seem to learn something? And if he did, look back at the text. Find evidence of what it is you think he learned. There's not a right and a wrong answer here, but what does the text suggest? What has he learned? And maybe, what has he learned that George Willard hasn't yet learned? In the story Death, we see the death of George's mother, Elizabeth Willard. We also return specifically to a character again, I believe for the first time, and that is Dr. Reefy. So if you remember Dr. Reefy from, what would it have been, week 3? He's the one that wrote the little truths on his paper and wadded them up, and they became little balls of hard paper pills in his pockets. So what's the effect of having already read a Dr. Reefy story? When he sits down and starts having these conversations with Elizabeth Willard, how does that make the story different than if this were a new character or a new doctor that we hadn't met before? In other words, Anderson has spent a lot of time world building in the novel, and now he starts to, in I think fairly subtle ways, reap the rewards of that world building. We now recognize people, much like people do in Winesburg. So he sort of created this sleight of hand trick where we almost at this point are like citizens of Winesburg. When Dr. Reefy comes in, when George comes in, when Elizabeth comes in, when Helen White comes in the next story, we know them. We have slowly been exposed to not only them as characters, but their thoughts, their hopes, their dreams. And so this, I think, begins sort of what I call the payoff section of the novel, where things begin to wrap up. Certainly George's mother dying is a major event in the main character's life. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue reading forward. And one of the things we notice is that as Elizabeth Willard comes to visit Dr. Reefy, she doesn't get along with George's father very well. So she goes to Dr. Reefy and begins sort of opening up to him. And we get this passage. The woman's voice began to quiver with excitement. To Dr. Reefy, who without realizing what was happening had begun to love her, there came an odd illusion. He thought that as she talked, the woman's body was changing, that she was becoming younger, straighter, stronger. When he could not shake off the illusion, his mind gave it a professional twist. It is good for both her body and her mind, this talking, he muttered. I hope when you read this that you recalled the idea of the grotesque and what a grotesque is and how it is sort of a shriveled person, using the metaphor of the apples in the fields. So if you're looking at that, you may have noticed that talking about her life and experiences seems to, at least to Dr. Reefy, seems to be unshriveling Elizabeth Willard. That perhaps in unburdening herself of the things that she has long carried as burdens in talking to Dr. Reefy, which would strike us today almost as sort of a therapy session or a counseling session, but they wouldn't have called it that in 1917. She is becoming younger. And remember that the thing that keeps the author in the Book of the Grotesque from being a grotesque is the young thing inside of him, as Anderson puts it. So as she unshrivels, she begins to look younger and straighter and stronger. So a question I have is, can we read this as Elizabeth Willard's grotesqueness reversing? What's being removed here? What truth is she maybe finally letting go of? And is this a sign that grotesqueness is not permanent? It certainly has seemed permanent through most of the novel, but is this sort of a ray of hope that Anderson offers at this moment? And toward the end of Death, we get sort of the scenes of George with his mother before she dies. And I'm sure you've noticed that among the many, many other things that Winesburg, Ohio is interested in, it's interested in the story of coming of age, of going through the things that make children into adults. And one of the great successes of the novel is that when it approaches these universal moments, these issues and rites of passage that we all face, marriage, death, love, it keeps them very universal. In other words, we get a clear sense of what Anderson is saying more generally about humanity, but it never avoids the specific details. In fact, its analysis of these issues, I would say, is stronger, is more affecting because of those specific details. Think of George sitting in this room with his mother and how the entire scene is grounded in the details of the room, the details of the characters, and how they say and what they say. If this were just a sort of general story about losing a parent, it would be sort of identifiable as sort of a universal rite of passage or an idea, but it wouldn't affect us because we wouldn't know the characters. They would be ciphers for us. Anderson's great masterstroke in Winesburg is that these are both fully realized, individual, unique characters, and very often also symbolic stand-ins for all people and the things that all people go through. And we are finally sort of in the final two stories of the novel. And the first one, called Sophistication, happens sort of as right before George is done and ready to leave Winesburg. Helen White, who's actually older than George, has already left Winesburg. She's gone off to college in the city. And she comes home during the summer. And she and George see each other again. And we get this passage that she, Helen White, thought that the months she had spent in the city, the going to theaters and the seeing of great crowds wandering in lighted thoroughfares, had changed her profoundly. She wanted him, meaning George, to feel and be conscious of the change in her nature. So first of all, why would she think this? Why would she think that going to the theater and walking down streets with great crowds would change her profoundly? That she has become a profoundly different person than she was a year ago in Winesburg. Well, part of it's what we've talked about all through the book, that the city is different. The city offers things. The city changes things. People want to leave the rural to go to the city. But I think it's also important to realize that in order to sense the change in her, she has to come back to Winesburg, where people would expect her to be more or less Winesburgian. And then the other question, why would she want to make George aware of this? Well, the obvious answer is because she maybe has feelings for George, or she thinks George has feelings for her, and she wants to seem attractive, not just in a physical sense, but in a sort of personality sense. And George seems to be an enlightened enough individual that this change in her might be attractive to him. But it sets this up as what she thinks is important and what she thinks George thinks is important. And I would argue, I think probably what George thinks is important as well. But it's important to see how this story plays out with that sort of set as the initial understanding. So before we get to the sort of final plot development between George and Helen, I want to take a moment and look at a passage from Sophistication that is not really about them, but it's about where they are. And this might be, it probably is, my favorite passage from all of Winesburg, Ohio. And really one of my favorite passages from all of American literature. And it seems fairly inconsequential at first, just describing the small town the night after the fair. And small towns still have fairs. The Vigo County Fair happened just a month or so ago, and I think every county in Indiana probably has the fair where the rides roll in and the people who run the rides and the games, and it takes over the fairway for a week, and everybody comes out, and then everybody goes back home. And we get this passage describing that. And certainly as I'm reading, ask yourself, how much has this changed in, 98 years? There's something memorable in the experience to be had by going into a fairground that stands at the edge of a middle western town on a night after the annual fair has been held. The sensation is one never to be forgotten. On all sides are ghosts, not of the dead, but of living people. Here, during the day just past, have come the people pouring in from the town and the country around. Farmers with their wives and children and all the people from the hundreds of little frame houses have gathered within these board walls. Young girls have laughed, and men with beards have talked of the affairs of their lives. The place has been filled to overflowing with life. It has itched and squirmed with life, and now it is night, and the life has all gone away. The silence is almost terrifying. One conceals oneself standing silently behind the trunk of a tree, and what there is of a reflective tendency in his nature is intensified. One shudders at the thought of the meaninglessness of life, while at the same instant, and if the people of the town are his people, one loves life so intensely that tears come into the eyes. So, this is, I would say, Anderson's last, his final wide angle, so to speak, in the language of film, the wide shot consideration of Winesburg itself. All of his descriptions of Winesburg, the kids going out to pick berries at the very beginning, the fall in which they discuss whether or not it's good to be married, the lovely evening when the town itself seems to want to get someone drunk, the snowy streets when Reverend Hartman and Kate Swift are doing what they do. We've gotten lots of ideas of Winesburg, and yet this final shot is the one that Anderson chooses to leave us with. What is he saying about Winesburg here, and what is he saying about rural life here, and what is he saying about the people, the humans who live there? I think you can argue that it's sort of an elegy for the living. The ghosts of these people who come out and have something special to do linger here, and this is sort of where the contact is in this place. And is it genuine? Probably not. People are probably making more small talk than they are talking about their deep, dark secrets. But that, we've come to expect, is the truth of Winesburg. So is this still the way a county fair would work? Or has something changed here? Certainly it's more of a special event then than it would be now, with all of the distractions we have. But the idea that the fair shows that life is meaningless, and it's so intense that it is dripping with meaning. It feels like a contradiction, and yet Anderson would argue it isn't. So if you want to take a snapshot of Winesburg, the town, to remember, to consider for papers and exams, this is an excellent one. And finally, we end sophistication. Remember, it starts with Helen White wanting to sort of seem sophisticated and debonair and attractive to George. And it ends with George and Helen playing like kids, or even like animals. And it ends with them rolling down the hill, acting like they're 10 years old again, sort of pushing off all the trappings of sophistication. And then they sort of stand up, they dust themselves off, and she takes his arm, and we hear, for some reason they could not have explained, they had both got from their silent evening together the thing needed. Man or boy, woman or girl, they had for a moment taken hold of the thing that makes the mature life of men and women in the modern world possible. What is the thing that the narrator is describing here? If they act like children instead of kissing or doing other adult things that they consider, and that is the thing that makes the mature life of men and women in the modern world possible, then how might this relate back to what we hear at the very beginning of the book, relating to youth versus becoming a grotesque? The old man is not a grotesque because of the young thing inside of him. Here, they grab hold of the thing that makes mature life possible by acting like children. So ultimately, what is the book saying about youth and the role of youth in what Anderson here calls the modern world, which his idea of the modern world would certainly be one that is being overtaken by machinery and automation and all of these somewhat frightening things. We're sort of almost immediately after, or during even, I'd have to check my dates, World War I, the first modern war where people were slaughtered in mass by machines, and people didn't know how to understand that. Farmers look around and see their fields being plowed by machines, and they don't do it anymore. So if that's maturity, if that's mature life in the modern world, what role does youth play? And is youth, if it's the remembrance of a simpler time personally, then is the argument here that to survive the modern world, we have to remember a time culturally when it was simpler, when Winesburg was the norm rather than the exception? Is that the youth, the innocence that saves us? And in reaching the final story, departure, we reach the end of Winesburg's story in the book, certainly not Winesburg the town. We assume it goes on and changes with the 20th century. But we certainly reach the end of the story of George Willard in Winesburg. I don't think it's an accident that the last story in the novel is George leaving on the train. We remember Elmer did that earlier, and I mentioned how we keep an eye out for that happening again. And here it happens again. But this departure is very different than Elmer's. Elmer sort of throws a punch, jumps on it, and is gone. No one to see him off except George, who is confused after having been punched. But here, as George makes his way to the train station the morning that he leaves, on the station platform, everyone shook the young man's hand. Notice he's a young man now, not a boy. More than a dozen people waited about. Then they talked of their own affairs. So the town comes out to see George off. How do we read this metaphorically? The slide says, can we? But of course we can, or I wouldn't ask. So how can we read this metaphorically? The town comes out to see George off. If George is ultimately going off to become a writer and tell the story of Winesburg, then it becomes very symbolic that the town comes out to see him off and set him off on this adventure that will ultimately result in the town being characterized and remembered. And the story teeters awfully close to ending on a sentimental note, that George, local boy makes good, takes off on the train to go to the city and become something great. And that is, those glasses would be pretty rose-colored if that were the case. But Tom Little, yet another citizen of Winesburg, who takes the tickets at the train station, has this reaction. We get this as sort of not the final passage, but certainly one of the final thoughts of the novel. Tom Little punched his ticket, meaning George's. He grinned, and although he knew George well, and knew on what adventure he was just setting out, made no comment. Tom had seen 1,000 George Willards go out of their towns to the city. It was a commonplace enough incident with him. So here, Tom Little is the pin that bursts the balloon, the sort of great, grand hopefulness for George Willard. And here, Tom Little, he keeps it to himself. He doesn't spoil it for people. He keeps his interior thoughts in his interior, which of course we have seen repeatedly in Winesburg. But how are we supposed to read this in relation to our expectations and hopes for George? If we believe he wrote the book within the world of the book, then we know that he succeeds in some way. He wrote this book chronicling Winesburg. But we don't actually know that it was ever appreciated. We don't know that he became a success outwardly. So it could be that he's just one of many that leave the small town to go to the city hopeful, like Seth in the earlier story, and really doesn't find success. And that would be a much more realistic ending. Certainly if everybody that left the small town for the city succeeded, we would have more successes in the world than we do. So Anderson tempers the sort of loveliness of the ending with some reality, even if it is just Tom Little's own thoughts. And it leads us to the final question. Do we have hope for George when the train pulls out of the station? And that question, of course, by extension, is do we have hope for Winesburg? Will George go on and be Winesburg at its best? We think probably, because of the book that we're reading, but we can't know that. And that sort of uncertainty of George as the character representing the town, and by extension then the town itself, is really, I think, where Anderson wants to leave us. Winesburg is lovely and complicated and secretive, but it is representative of a certain idea of America, an American culture, an American life, pre-industrial revolution. And what chance does it have moving forward? Well, we, of course, have the foresight of 100 extra years. And we know that the small town is not gone, but we know that it does not look like Winesburg anymore. If you go down Main Street in most small towns, even just in this area, you will not see multiple stores selling the same things. You won't see multiple stores often at all. You'll see boarded up windows. You'll see a sense of dilapidation in a lot of small towns, as there is very little tax base or very little incentive for them to be kept up. But you will also find the people still living there that have not gone away, that want to be there. And I think maybe that's the argument of Winesburg, that we are both losing and maintaining this place that is so central in the American imagination and certainly in American literature. So as we move forward, I encourage you to look at this final moment of Winesburg as maybe a prediction, maybe possibility. All right, thank you for making it to the end of the presentation. We'll be back next week with a new novel, Bless Me Ultima, in a completely different place, completely different time. Thank you very much.